If it's anywhere like 100, 115, I'm not sure ad world will feel it. Should oil get closer to like $125, that's where we would start to see some pretty meaningful cuts. That's a pretty extreme scenario. It doesn't have a lot of historic comp.
You're listening to Media Monitor, where we break down what's happening in the media and the advertising industry and tell you what it actually means.
Hi, Kelly. How are you?
Oh, we're both so eager to see each other. You know why I think that is?
Yeah,
We're finishing each other's sandwiches.
I like the reference.
Yeah, it's we got to spend
It's a
some
good
time
movie.
together this week, and now I think we were just so eager to get back on the pod and start recording.
Who doesn't love a good Friday afternoon pod session for sure?
Well, Sean, you'll have to bear with me. I know you know this, but my computer reached the end of its life. I am working on a loaner laptop, and we're going to just make this happen. So for those of you watching, if there's a lag in my video or a lag in my audio, we're just doing our best. We're hanging in.
Yep. We thought it was more important to get the pod out than to get you a new laptop is really what it comes down to.
We have to
Yeah.
give the listeners
pod
what they want.
Pod is the priority.
Yes.
For sure.
But so like I was saying, we got to see each other face to face this week. We did a few presentations in New York for our clients.
The Big Apple.
The Big Apple. It was a great time. I think our clients were really interested in what you had to say. You always bring the content. And so sharing a little bit of that here is what we thought made sense, especially because, you touched on some of the geopolitical economic indicators that are impacting the world. And we wanted to take a minute to really think about how that is applying to the advertising industry. And the response that we got back from the clients who heard what you had to say was that it was really interesting. It resonated with them. They wanted to hear more. And so we wanted to share it with all of you.
Yeah, right. And then when I think about March, right, I think most people think March Madness, spring. I think pre-earnings. And so I thought it was a good time for us to kind of bring up and talk about ways that we might see the economy impacting ad spend in the short term as well as long term. And so, yeah, would love to kind of sit and just chat through a little bit of what we did. Hopefully I don't nerd out too much. I was super excited in terms of what we had built out. I thought it was really cool modeling. But again, not that many takers on trying to lead them into model questions. Everyone kind of kept it high level. So maybe at some point I'll be able to talk to my heart's content on the modeling piece. But again, for today, for our listeners, we'll also try to keep it more high level.
Yeah. And maybe it's worth calling out, because we don't do it too often, who our customers are and why pre-earnings is something that's relevant. So, we have our media plan management tools that are great for the brands, the agencies, the holding companies, and they use that to plan. But then on the other side, we have our data business, and we have customers spanning, the likes of the large tech companies to ad tech platforms to even, agencies find this interesting as well. But we also have an investor segment. We have capital markets customers, and this was particularly interesting for them. So I guess let's dive into it and talk a little bit about what we're seeing. Where do you want to start, Sean?
Yeah, I think maybe start where the headlines are. I think everyone is talking the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices, to a lesser extent, liquid natural gas. So I figured that could be like a good place to start, given that tends to be what is all the rage in terms of discussion right now. So I thought maybe that's a good starting point. Now, I think also to kind of, you were going to say something?
Well, I was going to say, we're hearing it in the news. I heard an interesting stat this morning that raspberries are a leading indicator on the price of gas. So because of how difficult it is to transport raspberries, that's kind of that indicator. So when you start seeing those prices rise, you know that they're going to trickle down to the price at the pump, which is what makes it real for all of us, right? When we're going to the store, when we're doing our shopping, we see that impact, right? So yeah, we gotta apply what's going on in the world to our focus, our industry.
Yeah. I mean, it's not the other thing too is like folks often equate a barrel of oil to refinement and then something that goes into your gas tank if you drive, a gas car. But like Oil is everywhere, right? Oil is in plastics. It's in a lot of cosmetics, right? Like it's a, byproduct in terms of a lot of petroleum-based stuff. If you ever do home improvement, right? A lot of petroleum-based finishes or things like that if you're redoing your home. So like a barrel of oil ends up in literally millions of places throughout the economy. And so that's why it tends to be a real big focus for people because it is very real in terms of like oil goes up, gas goes up, and then also prices everywhere go up, not just because of the transportation element, but because it's actually an ingredient in so many things that we use, consume, look at, leverage, whatever. So it tends to be one of those leading indicators. The interesting thing, though, is for despite it being such a leading indicator in terms of the overall economy, from an ad spend perspective, it's not as impactful as you would imagine. And there's a few reasons for this. One, from an ad spend perspective, there's often a lag when it comes to economic headlines all the way through to what happens with ad spend. And part of that is the nature of advertising. For many creative campaigns, etc., some of those campaigns may have already been, in motion for a full year, right? If you think about how long it takes to write a creative, script a creative, go out and pitch agencies to run it, buy the ads for it, and eventually have it run, that might be a full year from the time that a brand had a meeting to bring it to life all the way through to when you see it on your phone or your TV set or wherever. So there tends to be this pretty like long chain of events that leads into advertising that a single economic headline, maybe a bumpy month, doesn't really slow that train down because it takes a while for that train to stop. But when it does, then you start to see that impact. So I found in terms of doing some kind of nerdy analysis that on average, for the categories that are super sensitive to oil price changes, it still takes about 2.5 months to show up in the data. So if we think about kind of like earnings in Q1, I actually don't expect a lot of what is currently happening to show up in earnings in Q1. And to even a certain extent, probably only starting to kind of trickle in come Q2. So I think there's this interesting dynamic where we might not see the full effect of all of this oil talk until well into Q3. Which is a
Mm.
very real risk, but it's slow, right? It takes minimally about 2 months for some key categories to show up. What's interesting is that some are more sensitive than others. So what comes to mind is travel, particularly airlines and cruises, tend to cut ad spend faster when oil goes up. And then restaurants, personal care, like hair care, lipstick, etc., would be part of personal care. And car makers are all ones that tend to cut budget when oil starts to creep up. So it's one of those where, as we're watching this, we're kind of also watching, to your Raspberry point, what's happening with personal care ad spend, right? What's happening to restaurant ad spend? Where's that going? Because then we'll kind of get a sense of just how much oil conversation has started to trickle into the economy by watching these key kind of categories and subcategories. So it's something
So
we're watching.
let me play that back. So you're saying that due to the chain of events that need to occur in order to even get an advertising campaign approved, committed, placed, and running, we're going to see a lag time before any, shifts happen. And
Yeah.
specifically when it comes to oil and gas, it's going to be more influential on certain markets, travel, restaurants, personal care, auto. And then from there, I'm guessing you're going to say that there are certain places where those ads are more likely to run, and thus potentially there's an impact more on those tickers, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. Like a travel category tends to be very involved in social, right? It's a medium where you can kind of post cool pictures about where you go or where you could go, and it's a very visual medium, right? And it doesn't need to be this like fancy video ad, right? The picture alone speaks 1,000 words in terms of travel. It's cold where you are. Look at this very warm place that you see in front of you, right? It's a very easy way to sell to go somewhere, whether it's a plane that takes you there or a cruise ship. So that tends to be a place where it does really well from like a creative side. On the plus side, when it starts to get cut, those are also places that we tend to see some sensitivity given the share. It's a bit of a delicate balancing act because it's also what we have found historically, analyzing the data back to 2009, is the places where performance ads run tend to
Mhm.
be also the places that are a little more insulated because if I have to defend my budgets from being cut, I'm going to want to point to the things that will give me ROAS. And
Right.
what's great is a lot of these tools, like social media tools, right or wrong, in the tool itself, it basically gives you day of what your ROAS is doing, your return on ad spend. And so the benefit is like I can very easily defend my spend there. It's harder for me to defend my spend on TV because I either have to run a study or I have to kind of cobble something together to show the benefit. It's not that TV doesn't benefit from an ad campaign. It's just if I'm up against the wall and my CFO is telling me to cut somewhere, I'm going to cut someplace where I can't make the argument easily to him or her about, my ad spend. So I think that's kind of like key too, in terms of like the balancing act of like they're over indexed in terms of, places like social, but on the flip side, those tend to also be a little resilient to ad spend cuts. So it'll probably be a both end in
Mm,
terms of what we're seeing over the next couple of months.
gotcha. So anything else in oil that you wanted to call out?
Yeah, I just want to highlight too, right? I think there's a lot of conversations of like what happens at $100. And historically, we pulled data back to 2009. There's not a ton of data when oil starts to creep above $100. But we ran a bunch of simulations and we would say, look, if it's anywhere like 100, 115, which we've seen historically, right around kind of post-pandemic, it kind of spiked real high up into I think like $112 a barrel. It'll shave a little off the top, but I'm not sure like the ad world as we know it will feel it in a meaningful way. Should oil get closer to like $125 a barrel, that's where we would start to see some pretty meaningful cuts that are happening in ad spend. But again, that's a pretty extreme scenario that doesn't have a lot of historic comp against it. So it'd have to be pretty crazy. Now I've seen headlines of like what happens if it's $200 a barrel and all those things, but like I think those are headlines to bring you in. Again, I don't know all that much about oil production. It feels extreme given the historical data is like real high oil prices tend to be that like $115, $118 a barrel, comping against history. Again, I would put the extreme scenario at 125. If we start to see that, then yeah, we'll start to see some pretty big impact in the ad community.
So another hot topic this week is liquid natural gas
Yep.
and LNG, right? So talk to me about what you're seeing for that piece of the pie here. How is change going to impact the advertising world?
Yeah, so similar story to oil. The thing that I would highlight is I don't know how many liquid natural gas nerds we have out there. So I'll kind of also say that in most places, this is not be all end. Also, if you are a nerd, please don't correct me. I know that I'm oversimplifying, but kind of liquid natural gas is often a byproduct of drilling for oil, right? Usually in these oil wells, between the top of the rocks and then where the oil is actually sits a whole bunch of natural gas. So as you pump oil, so too comes out this natural gas. And for a lot of oil companies, they try to siphon it off and then kind of cool it to a point where it becomes a liquid and then sell it all around the world. People love natural gas. So there is a market for it, but it's usually tied to oil drilling. So when oil drilling is pretty flourishing and oil drops on a per barrel basis, so too does liquid natural gas, and they kind of go hand in hand, right? So they are deeply correlated because they are produced essentially at the same time. The interesting thing is, specific to the headlines here, is a lot of that production is really centralized in one or two locations because it's a very complicated process
Hmm.
to cool natural gas. So there's a huge global impact right now that's actually probably more impacting liquid natural gas than even oil. So there's a lot of volatility here. But from an ad spend perspective, we also see that same kind of lag period. For the categories we analyzed in terms of our lag analysis, is it typically won't show up in our data for at least 2 to 4 months post an
Hmm.
increase in costs in terms of ad spend cuts. Right, they're inverted, but not wildly so. But some key categories that we've seen are pretty sensitive to liquid natural gas are alcohol, insurance, and restaurants. The alcohol piece, I'm not honestly 100% sure. Right, it's one of those things that are correlated. I'm not sure there's a causation. The insurance piece, though, I think is an interesting one because it goes back to that whole production and it being tied to oil prices. Insurance is very sensitive to two specific categories globally. What's happening with new car sales and what's happening with new home sales. Because usually when one of those things happens, people tend to take out new insurance policies.
You
If
need a
you've had the
policy.
same car, if you've had the same car for like 30 years or 20 years, or you've had your house and you're locked in, you're not really shopping around a lot for insurance policies. So we tend to see that it's very sensitive more to that. So this is one of those where like Yes, they are correlated, but the real causation is that car spend, advertising goes down because less people are buying cars when oil gets expensive. So therefore, then insurance cuts down, right? So it's tied, but it's not exactly because of liquid natural gas. Restaurants is also tied just to discretionary income, right? It's all about if
Yeah.
everything everywhere is getting more expensive, I'm going to eat out less, right? It's a pretty one for one in terms of what happens there. But again, we're talking extreme scenarios. You would have to hit over, 425 per BTU to get to a place where there's a meaningful impact on ad spend, which really historically is pretty rare to ever even get close to that. So it would have to be a pretty extreme scenario to kind of show up in ad spend in a meaningful way for cuts.
But if it did show up, that kind of gets to what we talked about last week when we talked about TV, particularly linear TV, because you touched on some categories that were some of the main types of categories that ran on linear
For
because
sure.
they run on sports, right?
Yeah.
Live
Alcohol is a huge
TV,
one.
alcohol,
Yeah.
restaurants, insurance.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
talked about those local offers to go get in, get your Grinch meal, I think you said it was.
Yeah.
So I'd imagine that, if we got to that point, the 425, that then we would see an impact on those publishers because advertisers are going to pull back.
Yeah.
And
Right.
that makes sense, right?
Very TV heavy in terms of the categories that get hit for sure.
Gotcha. Okay, so we talked about the big ones. I think the third one is the unemployment rate, right? And I know we did an episode maybe almost a month ago now. We talked about the jobs report and how that impacts the advertising community. But I think, the flip side of the jobs report is the unemployment rate. So talk to us a little bit about how that number can influence advertising.
Yeah, right. So if we look at the unemployment rate, I think to one of my favorite TLC songs, and slowly but surely it's been creeping along. And so I creep. Yeah. One of those. And the unemployment rate has kind of been slowly creeping up over the last couple of both first reports, second revisions, third revisions, right? It keeps kind of going up and up and up. And that's one where like it's a very clear signal because when there are less people working, it means there's multiple points in the economy that things are starting to kind of become shaky, uncertain, kind of fall down. So it's one of those great indicators because it's a good summary of like multiple things that are happening in different key areas of the economy. Whereas like some of these others are very restricted to very isolated parts or like very upstream, very downstream, that thing. So unemployment rates, by context is almost, I would say probably like, what is it? 10 times more impactful on ad spend than like oil prices or liquid natural gas are. So like for all of the conversation that's currently happening around prices of oil, things like that, when we modeled it out, kind of a even half a percentage point increase in unemployment is almost 10 times more impactful on cuts to ad spend than anything that could be happening in oil or gas. So that's one where we're really paying attention. And even there, from like a scenario perspective, it doesn't need to creep up a ton more than where it's at. I think right now we're at like 4.5% unemployment for the country, which by the way, for context, historically is still a pretty good unemployment rate, right? Like it's not
Yeah.
doom and gloom, right? We hear a lot about layoffs, but like when we actually see the real numbers come out, and again, we can discuss, they're not yet like panic level, but zero point 0.8 is when our models start to kick in, where we start to see some meaningful cuts to ad spend. And 4.8 is not that much higher than where we're at today, right? You give it a couple of revisions in terms of the second or third job numbers, right? You get your first initials, and it could get there sooner rather than later if all of the other things are impacting other parts of the economy. And for there, it's much more widespread too from a category sensitivity. You've got some of our favorites, right? The auto piece, but also apparel, right? People are buying less new clothes. So clothes will then advertise less. Restaurants, time and time again, restaurants is kind of the bellwether of the economy throughout
Yeah.
because it's again one of those where it's like very quickly people will start cutting ad spend there as one of the very first places, right? And so that tends to be a pretty good leading indicator of anything within the ad world. But even places like credit cards, right? As people start to draw more on credit cards to pay, then credit cards advertise less because they're also worried about delinquent payments. They're worried about risk to their own balance sheets. So they don't want new credit cards being issued at times when, credit is uncertain or maybe people don't have jobs. They want less of that. So then they pull back on ad spend. So that's what we've seen. And again, it's a lot more wide ranging in terms of impact to the economy. But kind of to wrap it up too, I don't want to kind of leave it as all doom and gloom, right? I think the first quarter looks decent. I think second quarter will probably chug away. Maybe we'll start to see some softness, but it's also going to be masked by the World Cup. So I don't know if we'll get like a really good read on what's happening until like mid Q3. But like between March Madness, then leading into the World Cup in 2 months, Q2, Q3, I think are going to be at a top line. You'll have to kind of like dig into the data a bit and really try to understand some trends, because top line I don't think is going to tell us much given the 10 polls that are out there.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to do some sort of World Cup focused reporting to understand, if you could take that out of the equation, what does it look like? Because it's going to mask any sort of potential declines, overall.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I guess net, what we're saying is taking a look at these economic indicators, price of oil, liquid natural gas, unemployment. Unemployment is, you said, 10 times more likely to drive an impact on advertising. So while it's important that we keep tabs on this, that's really the one to watch for.
Absolutely.
Nice. Well, I think this was really insightful, and more on this as we have it. But thank you so much, Sean.
Yeah, it's been great connecting twice this week, and look forward to chat next week. Hope you have a great weekend.
Next week on a new laptop. Can't wait.
Very
Thanks, Sean.
exciting. Have a good one. That's Media Monitor. Follow us and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts every Wednesday for a new episode. And as always, thanks for listening.